Thank you all for braving the weather to come out to our first Urban Lab event this morning. I am Stephen Pettigo. I'm the director of the Urban Lab. You all should have received an email from me regarding the event. So welcome. It's good to see you all. On behalf of the Schack Institute of Real Estate and the Center for American Entrepreneurship, we are excited to have you all here to talk for our first event of the semester in terms of talking about the rise of global startups. As I mentioned earlier, today's event is a partnership with the Schack Institute as well as the Center for American Entrepreneurship, which is a nonpartisan policy organization in Washington, whose mission is about educating policy leaders about the importance of entrepreneurship and innovation. As many of us know, that the United States really is sort of the birthplace for the dominant location for high-tech startups and venture capital. But as the research that we'll talk about this morning, which is a new report from our two institutes, that is changing. Those trends are changing. We're starting to see the dramatic rise of startup and venture capital activity in places like Europe and Asia and elsewhere. So that really is the goal of today's conversation, is to talk really about three key questions. What are the current trends that we see in the nature of startups and venture capital? How is that shift happening? Why is it happening? And really, how can particularly the U.S. and our cities here across the country really react to those policy implications? We've got three great panel conversations for you planned today. The first will start with a conversation actually about the new research. Hopefully you were able to pick up a brief copy of the executive summary as you came in. I'm pleased to be joined with Richard and Ian, who are going to talk a little bit about the research and sort of the key takeaways. Our second panel is an excellent panel as well. We have a conversation with some of the country's leading venture capitalists reacting to the research, providing you their thoughts on that. We'll take a small, short break for some coffee and to stretch your legs. And then we'll close this morning talking about the policy implications of what this research means, and what does it mean for cities, and what does it mean for the U.S. as a whole. So with that, please join me in welcoming our first panel, Richard Florida and Ian Hathaway. So for those of you, turn on the mic. There we go, the mic's working now. So just a quick brief introduction of our panelists today. As I mentioned, we are pleased to be joined by my colleague, Rich Florida, who many of you probably have seen at some of our Urban Lab events. Richard is a distinguished fellow at the lab, is a university professor at the University of Toronto, and a best-selling author. Many of you have probably read The Rise of the Creative Class, particularly if you're my students who have, as well as looked at the New Urban Crisis. So Richard, welcome. And we're also joined with Ian Hathaway. Ian was sort of our lead researcher on this project, and really was the, I would say, data guru behind looking at the research. Ian is the research director at the Center for American Entrepreneurship. He's a non-senior fellow resident at Brookings, and he's also has taught for us here at NYU as part of our cities program. So again, welcome Ian and Richard. So Ian, let's start with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the research, how it came about, and what are some of the key takeaways that you'd have the audience sort of think about as they think about your work? Just hold it up.
Hello. Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, thanks for having me here today. So this really started earlier this year. Richard and I were having one of many conversations about innovation, the geography of innovation and entrepreneurship. And, but more specifically, we were talking about it in this context of, the rise of the rest in America, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar, but if you're not, it's this idea of emerging entrepreneurial hubs in places in the middle of the country, away from the main tech hubs of California and New York and so on. And Richard had a very simple but profound statement, which was, I feel like there's a rise of the rest happening, but it's just not happening in America. And so I guess we sort of knew this already to be true at a very high level. Actually, as we were developing the data and the research, there was I think it was a Wall Street Journal article that came out that was saying that, the rise of China and so on. But, Richard and I spent a lot of time thinking about cities, and innovation today is happening in cities. So we wanted to cluster the data by metropolitan areas globally. So we did that, and we ended up with a list of over 300 metropolitan areas covering 60 countries worldwide. We've structured the data, and this is, I guess, sort of moving into your second part of your question about what's unique about this, is that we are looking at the level of cities, and we're looking at changes over a more than 10-year period. And to my knowledge, that hasn't really been done on this wide of a scale. So that was really, that was kind of the new thing that we were doing. I think at a very high level, there are a few takeaways here. So we're going through a huge boom cycle in venture capital and high-tech startups globally. Over the last 7 or so years, we've seen a near doubling in venture capital deals worldwide, and a near tripling of capital invested in those deals. So obviously, deal sizes are growing much larger. The United States is seeing, in 2017 was a post-dot-com record for capital deployed in venture-backed startups. And by all accounts, 2018 may surpass the dot-com peak of 2000. And yet, the rest of the world is growing at an even faster pace. So as late as the early to mid-1990s, the United States captured around 95% of venture capital globally. Over the next 2 decades, that gradually declined to around 3/4 by 2010, 2012, so a drop of about 20 percentage points. But in the last 5 years, there's been a 20 percentage point drop as well, to about half. Now,
So Ian, what are the cities that are on the top of the list, and what are these cities that are emerging, that are leading some of the trends that you're describing here?
Yeah. So so it depends on which way you look at it. So if you look at it from the cities where the most capital and deals are being deployed very strongly, main tech hubs in the U.S., a few in Europe, and these risers in Asia. But when you look at particularly in China. But when you look at the cities that are driving the increase, it's disproportionately coming from Asia. So, we can talk a little bit more about some of the nuances around that. But places like Beijing, Shanghai, San Francisco, and New York, I believe, are responsible for half the increase in venture capital deployed over the last half decade. 4 cities.
Wow. So Richard, what's your thoughts? What's your reactions to this as a person that has studied cities for a long time?
Well, first of all, I'm lucky to have you and Ian as colleagues and to work with people as bright as you guys. This is a pretty remarkable piece of work for the lab. Because since Sam and Stephen, it's funny to see my godfather at NYU looking over me, John Sexton, back there. I'm in John's gaze. Back to when John and I talked about my coming here, a hypothesis I had was that New York had become a leading tech hub. If you remember, John used to talk about FIRE. I always get that wrong. Finance, insurance, real estate, and I forget what the E is. Entertainment, maybe it's just real estate. Anyway, my hypothesis was that New York was transforming into much more of a tech economy. And of course, that has played out. Our data show this. What I don't think I anticipated was the extent to which the technology revolution would challenge New York's incumbent industries. Finance is being completely remade by fintech. But one of the things we've been talking about is the rise of urban tech, a whole cluster of industries: real estate, ride sharing, co-working, co-living, construction technology, delivery. And so we wanted to do 2 things. One, we wanted to document the growth of these technology hubs and position them and position New York. And 2, begin to think about this bigger revolution where cities are not just hosts of these ecosystems, but cities are the platforms of being transformed. So just a couple of quick things to echo what Ian said. We had this simple hypothesis, and to make it even plainer than Ian said, that the U.S. is starting to get its clocks cleaned in the most important source of its competitive advantage, that is venture capital-backed startups. Ian told you the number. For most of our lives, the U.S. had more than 95% of all venture capital-backed startups. That goes from Fairchild and its Fairchildren to Intel to Apple to Google. We can go down the list. These are the world Genentech, the world-defining companies. Ian told you how rapidly that decline is. That is falling off a cliff. And, you know, I'm a product of the 80s and 90s where people talked about declining U.S. competitiveness, right? Mike Porter, myself, a Harvard Business Review, the rise of Japan and Germany, the threat to steel and auto. Look, this is a much bigger threat. This decline in the U.S. as a set of startups, I think, and hopefully any will do something for the Journal, this is a big deal. So that's number one. The second thing is that, yes, the Bay Area remains the number one center of startups in the world. 25%, more or less?
Yeah, 20. Yeah.
20%. That's taking, and San Francisco has a much higher share of this than the Valley. One big subtext is the Valley is getting really clobbered. The traditional Silicon Valley suburban sprawl is getting really clobbered. New York City has more venture capital investment than Silicon Valley proper. But you see the rise of two big Chinese players, Shanghai and Beijing, but then these European cities, London, Berlin, we could go down the list, and then smaller Asian cities. So that's the first part of this. The second part of this is this next wave of technological innovation, which is going to be our next piece of research, this next wave of technological innovation. So the past was hardware, telecommunications, software, biotech, AI, all things that you could do in ecosystems. The next set of innovations are about transforming a city and urban life itself. And that's where our hypothesis is that the U.S. decline has been even more rapid. So it's a big issue, and just to echo what Ian said, people like to talk about the rise of the rest in the United States, the rise of Pittsburgh. I lived there for 20 years in Nashville, Detroit, Omaha. There may be some slight evidence of this, but where the rest are really rising as startup ecosystems are in big, big cities in other parts of the world.
So, Ian, are there any nuances to the study? Sort of, we've hit the high-level headlines, the shifting of venture capital across the world, big cities sort of leading. Are there any nuances to the research that you would sort of say, these are key facts that take a look at?
Yeah, well, so I think first it would be good to sufficiently, lay out the scope of this. We're just looking at, and you'll see our full report will be out in the next week or so. It's enormous. There's so much data, and we're just looking at capital inflows, right? So I think of venture capital as an input to the innovation process. We're not looking at some of the outputs of that. We're not looking at IPOs and M&A and valuations and things, and we'd like to do that. We'll take a look at that next year. The reason for that is data limitations. We wanted to go wide geographically, which makes it difficult to go deep in certain ways. Maybe we'll do it for a more limited scope of cities. So first there's that. But one of the things that struck out to me, I guess I'll say two things. There's this disconnect between the number of deals, so the number of companies getting funded, and the amount of capital going into them, especially when you look at Asia, doubly so for China. So a big question that I don't have the answer to, which is rising Asia for real? A lot of these cities where I think Beijing, something like 70% of the capital invested there in the last few years has gone into a handful of companies, and these are enormous, hundreds of millions of dollars of venture capital. And so, and many of these companies, not all, it's sort of a copycat model of ride sharing and various other technologies that are being applied to these big consumer markets. So but on the other hand, these people, the people working at these companies, they're gaining the valuable expertise of what it's like to start and scale a company, to grow many thousands of %. And it will be interesting to see what happens importantly with that wealth creation as that's plowed into the next generation of startups. So overall, I think there's this dichotomy. On the one hand, you see this massive rise in Asia, but on the other hand, I don't know how sustainable that really is.
Richard, what's your thoughts? Yeah, you see how lucky we are at the lab to have a collaborator like Ian who knows this data about where startup activity and venture is. So we've talked a lot about this, and I'm kind of two minds on it. On the one hand, it's pretty clear that there are these so-called mega deals. When we look at the data, over 500 million, over $1 billion, and they're preponderantly in Shanghai and Beijing. But they're big cities, and they have to deploy big companies, and they have to cover lots of people. So on the one hand, you say, they may be, the Bay Area is number one. I think Beijing's number two, right, in total volume. Then New York, I have it here. And Shanghai's close behind. So There are other indicators that they're pretty innovative, right? Not only are they generating these interesting startup companies, there's a new study by Richard Freeman and a Chinese colleague. Richard Freeman's a labor economist at Harvard, an economist of innovation, brilliant guy, that says that China is emerging as a massive player in scientific innovation, not just in volume of publication, in quality of publication, and in international co-author. I think that's all important. On the other hand, I think if you look at true innovation, truly cutting-edge, Schumpeterian, creative destruction, the kind of startups that will change the world, I think that's still predominantly a U.S. plus. And that's where I'm worried as an American. And I'm an American who lives part of the year in Canada, so I have a lot of texture on this. The United States is a harder place to do things now than any other time in my life. It's a harder place to get foreign talent into. It's a harder place for foreign talent to make a living. This isn't just about political polarization at the national level. People are worried about raising kids because of urban violence. Look, two of us live principally outside the United States. Leon lives in London. I split my time between Toronto and New York. And I think there are more and more people around the world who are saying, yeah, the U.S. used to be my first choice. But so the places that are really interesting when you look, the rise of London, the massive rise in Berlin, the surge of activity in the urban tech space with Sidewalk Labs and others in Toronto. Those are all things that begin to say could the balance be shifting away from the U.S. power centers, the Bay Area, New York, Boston, Seattle, Austin? Could it be over time and at the margin shifting? And I think the evidence we suggest is yes. And I think when we dig into these new emerging sectors, the evidence is going to be even more so. Look, I want to say one other thing with regard to New York. We're in New York. We love New York. NYU's in New York. This is a big deal for New York City. And it's a big deal for the real estate community. Urban tech things, urban innovation, urban startups are the fundamental disruptor of real estate and city building. And with all humility, the real estate industry has been slow to move on this. And what's coming in the future, Sidewalk Labs is just a little hint of what's to come in terms of mobility, parking, construction technology, modularity, home automation. The real estate community, my hunch, is at threat of the kind of disruption that has hit media or other sectors. So one of the things we'd really like to do at the lab, and we think we have a real competitive advantage at the lab, is to bring together these two things, these global startup ecosystems, innovation in urban areas with real estate and placemaking, and develop a real competitive advantage as a think tank, but also provide the kind of intelligence that the real estate industry and the city building industry can benefit from.
So the thing I'm sort of hearing and sort of taking away from the conversation between the two of you is that as we think about the rise of the rest, absolutely it's happening in other parts of the country, parts of the world. But as we think about the rise of the rest in terms of that phenomenon here in the U.S., what I think you're both saying is that that's actually a limited sort of phenomenon. True statement?
Yeah, I mean, we do see the emergence of, I think, the bona fide emergence of certain cities like Pittsburgh, like Indianapolis, Columbus, Ohio, in addition to many others that I just, like Boulder, and, there are a number of different places. I mean, what's interesting is that I think the United States has many more cities participating in the venture economy than other countries do. But yeah, but just the sheer scale of the rise of the global rest is, it just dwarfs.
And the venture capital innovation startup economy is incredibly concentrated. That's one of the things Ian's data just brings home. You take San Francisco, Beijing, Shanghai, New York, Boston. We have. One of the great things about this report is for the first time we've really developed a typology of the kinds of startup hubs. There are 6 superstar hubs. I mean, they account for 6 cities account for half of all venture capital startups and investment in the world. That's the Bay Area, New York City, London, Beijing, LA, and Boston. When you go down to the next tier, we call them the elite. Chicago and Austin and San Diego are in that group, but there's Bangalore and Delhi and Mumbai and Berlin and Paris and Stockholm and Shanghai and Singapore and Tel Aviv. You go down to the next tier, there are 20 cities. You got 8 U.S. cities, 7 Asian cities, 4 European cities, 1 Canadian city, Toronto. And at every tier, you can see that where the U.S. used to have 90% or 99%, and to be honest, somebody who spent 20 years in Pittsburgh, contributed a massive part of my life Pittsburgh's a blip. I mean, it's an increase, but it's a blip, and so is Detroit. Now, Boulder, what's really interesting, and Ian, we document this, he documents this in such great detail. The U.S. has this incredible capability in these college towns. Yeah. And Boulder is the one that sticks out, it's just this massive thing for its, punching above your weight, you couldn't do better than Boulder. But Austin is a product of Columbus. People discount Columbus with Ohio State and what's gone on around there. Ann Arbor, Michigan. Madison, Wisconsin. You've got these places in the old Rust Belt that are developing. So yeah, they'll be small. But the thing is, you say this in the report so nicely, you can do it from Madison now. You could do it from Boulder. Yeah, maybe there's an advantage to going to the big city, New York or San Francisco. But one of the things is true, that if you want to build a startup close by, a Boulder, a research lab at Boulder, or close by. One other thing I will say, I think we're seeing a bifurcation in the kinds of startups that can be built. If you're a pure technology-based startup, say in a field like biotech, or in a place that's close to science, you can do it close to a university, whether that's University of California, San Diego in biotech, University of Colorado Boulder. But if you're a startup that's playing in this more city-building urban space, you almost by definition have to migrate to a major metropolitan area, so New York City. So maybe we're seeing also a splitting in the kinds of startup ecosystems by the kinds of technologies they leverage.
Yeah, and just to add to one point to that, Boulder is actually a massive feeder for the startup ecosystem in Denver. Boulder is too small for a lot of these companies. There's a famous company called SendGrid that just went public last year, and so Boulder is the place where where these companies are being born. But when they have to grow up and scale, they're moving down the road to Denver. But that's a great thing. There's a nice relationship between these two ecosystems. But scale seems to be winning out here. That's one of the major themes from this work.
And look at the list of the elite, the superstars. When I was a kid, and my first research in the 80s was on venture capital-backed startups with a guy named Martin Kenney. You could not name a tech startup in a large city. They were all in the suburban Nerdistan of Silicon Valley, near an office park, out in the boondocks of Route 128, in suburban Austin. This is all big cities, and that's one of the things that really struck us. The Bay Area, but more San Francisco than the Valley, New York City, London, Beijing, LA, and I hate to call it a small city. The only small city in that group of elite is Boston. Not a small city by any stretch of the imagination, and very close to New York City. The migration of startup, venture, high-tech ecosystems into major urban areas for an urbanist is a shock. No one 20 years would have predicted that. They would have predicted the continuing growth of this in the suburban kind of industrial parks. So from a real estate perspective, a lot of look at, not that Google's a startup anymore, just look at Google's presence in New York City, never mind the satellite companies around them. The rise of technology creates a lot of opportunities for big cities, but creates also a lot of challenges, driving up costs, making housing and office space less affordable, blah, blah, blah.
So before we turn this over to the audience for some questions, what do you guys see as sort of the policy implications for this? If you were to sort of share this with policymakers, what would you say the top 3 findings are that really raise awareness, alarm for policymakers?
Well, so for me, it's easy. Look, innovation is not a zero-sum game. Just because it's happening in other places doesn't mean that it can't happen here. But what I think the real risk is, and what we're screwing up as a country right now, is this global war for talent. This work clearly demonstrates that you do not have to come to this country anymore to start a high-tech company and raise venture capital. And we need to wake up to that reality as a nation.
Richard, thoughts?
Yeah, so I think a couple things. First, I think more so than the competitiveness crisis of the 80s, it suggests that the U.S. has really badly lost its way. And we have forgotten that we have to be an economically competitive country. We are embroiled in culture wars, political wars, polarization, all this other BS. We are losing our economic asset. So, and part of that is losing our ability to innovate, and part of that, and a large part of that, is losing the talent base. So I think for the first time in my life, the U.S. is truly in trouble. Even though it's not zero-sum, look, if the what are we at? What's share now? Venture capital-backed startups?
About half.
We lost half our competitive advantage in how long? 10 years?
Yeah, a couple decades.
20 years. I don't know how that's not an alarm bell in Washington, D.C., and in the headquarters companies of New York City, but to me, that is the biggest single alarm bell of my life. That is way bigger than the loss of steel in Pittsburgh or automobiles in Detroit, deindustrialization. This is the biggest single alarm bell that should be going off, and both parties in Washington have not a clue. So that's number one. The second thing is where I see hope, and a big ray of hope, in the ability of cities in the United States and around the world to develop their ecosystems, to work hard, to want to do this, to become more innovative. The transformation that's happening in Pittsburgh, in Detroit, in all of these places, Milwaukee, Indianapolis, Columbus. So where I see real ray of light in the U.S. is working with these public-private partnerships to strengthen the ecosystems, invest in innovators. But, number three, for the first time in my life in the United States, I see the tech economy as emerging as a villain. Who are the big villains now in the media? Who is the big villain in San Francisco? It's big tech. And look, big tech has played right into their hands on this. This is not, they played right into this. So now the big enemy in San Francisco, less so in New York, which I think is a good thing for New York, is big tech. They want to limit the number of tech startups. They want to ban tech startups from certain neighborhoods. They want to limit the ability of companies to come in, real estate developers to develop for the tech industry. Look, there's blame on both sides. Housing prices are up. Those cities have become more, I wrote a whole book about this. But that's like cutting off our arm to spite our face. If we undermine our tech advantage, what else do we have to generate wealth, to generate income, to generate competitiveness? So I think both of us, all of us, and the Urban Lab sees a big issue brewing here. And one of the things we can bring, not only with this report, but we hope to do a lot more of this, including deep dives. One of the things we'd love for Ian to be able to do is take a deep dive into the New York ecosystem, its neighborhoods, its composition. We hope to do this year over year and over time to provide data and facts to help stimulate this conversation. And maybe guys, it's not a national coalition. Maybe it's a coalition of mayors. Dreaming a dream. Maybe we're going to have how many mayors running for president? Let's do a countdown. Sorry, Bloomberg, Garcetti, Hickenlooper, who's the governor of Denver, O'Malley. Who am I missing, Stephen? De Blasio. We're up to 5. I think there's Mitch Landrieu. We're up, at least a half dozen mayors are going to run for president. Maybe a group of mayors, before this was done by industrialists in the national level and Republicans never, maybe a group of mayors could say, look, this is an issue for our country, both on innovation and on affordability and a new urban crisis. Maybe that's the way to tackle this.
So we have some time to take some questions from the audience, if there's any questions. There's some mics. If you want to queue up behind the mics, come on up. That's fine.
Thank you. My name is Mike Ehrlich. I'm from the New Jersey Institute of Technology. I'd like to, I see you, yes, thank you. So I'd like to potentially challenge you a little bit, because this monopoly of venture capital in the United States was not that the aberration? And this spreading out to the rest of the world, isn't that what you'd expect to see? I mean, when we invent a good idea like Lyft, they copy it in China. When we invent a good idea like Google, they copy it other places. Why would they not copy our venture capital industry? And why would you not expect to see this exactly this way? And in fact, the fact that we still have 50% relative to our world population represents still vast overrepresentation. I mean, if you believe as I do, good ideas are kind of uniformly distributed. And so should the startups maybe.
Great question.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point, and I think it goes to my point earlier about zero-sum thinking. But the fact for me that I'm hung on this, which is that the United States has been a huge beneficiary of foreign-born talent. It's been going on for a long time, and I guess I feel like we're in an era where the conditions are ripe, where we're just giving people more reasons to not come here and do that. So as a citizen of the world, it's great, right? I think this is a fantastic thing, but as an American, I'm a little concerned that we're losing our edge.
We agree. 100%.
Other questions? Yeah, please.
Hi, Dimitri of Columbia Tech Ventures. As you looked at the data, did you see a correlation between the inflows of capital into those cities and the rise of the creative class, particularly in the ones that are outside of the U.S.?
I can try this.
Repeat the question.
We have not done, do we see any correlation, statistical association between the inflows of capital and the creative class? We have not done any statistical analysis of this. The reason is, First of all, this is a very unique data set on the world. It's very hard to collect any data that's comparable across cities of the world. So we don't have, no one has data on the percentage of the creative class in cities of the world. We do have data on the creative class by nation, and we do have data on the creative class by U.S. metropolitan area. Those we have done. There is a very close correlation, a statistical association, between the percent of the workforce that are members of the creative class and venture capital investment by nation. And there's an extremely close correlation between the share of workers that are members of the creative class and the share of venture capital investment or the share of startup deals in U.S. metros.
Okay. Other questions? Please.
Hi, my name is Reed Bennett. I have an early stage startup, so I definitely have a dog in the fight when I say the following. It seems to me that venture capitalists that are in growth stage investing, maybe that's a contradiction in terms, kind of like all my friends that have good jobs in middle market PE and stuff like that. I'm wondering if there's a way to kind of, again, showing my dog in the fight, to force or encourage venture capitalists to actually be venture as opposed to capitalists, to take risk at an early stage, because obviously that's the beginning of the pipeline for breakthroughs, and also many shots on goal, and maybe some of them will survive.
Well, that's a question that's probably better answered by the next panel, I would say. But one of the things that, and I'm not a venture capitalist. I don't have deals coming across my desk every day, so I have limited knowledge of this. But one of the things that we are hearing, as part of the Center for American Entrepreneurship, we travel around and do roundtables in various cities. And it seems to me like early stage capital is getting increasingly difficult. Even among angels, they want to see, even in, I won't name the cities, but in leading cities, maybe even this one, people are saying that it's, angels are acting like VCs. They're acting like early stage VCs. You need to have traction, you need to have customers, and it just seems like there's something fundamentally changing at the beginning, at the early stage market. And I don't have the solution to that, but it's definitely something that we're observing in many places.
But he's humble, which is a good thing, which many intellectuals are. One of the things Ian did in this report is break out deals by stage. And when you read the report, there is a whole section on there in angel and early stage deals. Let me give you my take, and then you're going to tell me what I get, the nuance and what I get wrong. What I read in that analysis is that I would have expected more angel activity in a place like the Bay Area or New York. What we find is not so much of that. So two questions for you. What is the share of venture, roughly, investment that goes to angel and early stage deals now? And two, do you see any places that are doing, it seemed to me that the correlation between angel and early stage investing across metros was pretty much 90%. If you had a lot of venture capital investment and a lot of venture capital, you had a relatively hard amount of angel and early stage deals. Why don't you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, I don't remember what the exact figures are, but it's something, the percentage of capital is something like, let's say 10 at seed and angel stage. When you look at it at the very early stage market, you see a different list of cities, that are among the leaders. Heavily United States, very heavily United States, but also I see India. So going back to this point, this dichotomy between capital invested in deals, when you do that, many of those Asian giants fall down the list, but India seems to rise even higher, and then also places in Europe and the United States.
And it's interesting that a lot of our talent base in those early stage startups, it comes from all over the world, but is Indian. So that's very fascinating.
Okay, I have time for these last two questions.
Thanks. I'm Scott Kolber from Roadified Transit. Richard, you mentioned public-private partnerships, and I'm wondering if you could dig into that a little bit more deeply and talk about the extent to which government at all levels is possibly fueling some of these non-U.S., some of the growth in non-U.S. areas in funding.
But I do think this is an area where the U.S. has real competitive advantage in crafting flexible public-private partnerships, not only across levels of government, but across the private and public sector. In Canada and Toronto, we struggle with that. I think this is an area where we need more inquiry. This is the most under-researched area in the entire academic world. Trying to find a political scientist who studies this. And I actually think the real governance channel of the 21st century isn't what's done federally, what's done by the state, what's done by the local. It's how do these innovative governance mechanisms emerge, and how are they robust, and how are they democratic? So yeah, I think we still haven't, we had a conversation with the late Jeremy Nowak here about this, and about his book, The New Localism. I do think the U.S. still has an advantage here. What we tend to be is we're not able to really activate as much public sector capital, and I think that's a big issue, whereas in China, or even in Canada, certainly with regard to infrastructure projects and transit building projects, they're able to mobilize a lot more capital. But I think it's an area of we need a great deal more inquiry. I just think it's one of the most under-researched subjects we have on the books.
Great, thank you. Last question.
Hi, Devin Cremeen, student at Schack. I think it's evident that the data, which is very interesting data that you've all presented here today, shows that there's a distribution of capital across the world. And Richard, you brought up that the U.S. has really kind of salvaged and lost its competitive advantage. What are some ideas, some brainstorming solutions on some actionable items that we as the U.S. and we as Americans can get that back?
Things that, well, I don't think we're short on ideas. We're short on resolve and leadership. How long, Bobby, you probably, or John, how long have we been talking about the Startup Act?
6 years.
So this is the start, the core piece of this is the entrepreneur visa. 75,000 people who want to come here, create amazing companies, grow jobs, validated by professional investors, and we can't move the needle on that. That's insane to me. Why are we not stapling green cards to diplomas when people finish a bachelor's or master's or PhD? This just seems so easy to me, but we just aren't willing to do it. And I'm not going to go, we have panelists, there'll be, I guess, 2 panels from now who are much more versed in the politics of Washington than me, but it's simple to me. This is a very simple, there are other things too, like building our own talent base. I'm in the context of this international report, I'm focused on this one thing because it's so clear to me.
So in the long run, I'm actually kind of, in a bizarre way, optimistic. So let me tell you what I see as this kind of tale of 2 approaches, just very briefly, and why I think the U.S. could salvage this, going back to the two last questions. If you look at the world now and you look at China, you go, holy God, the Chinese have their act together. And I was just in Hong Kong, and you look at One Belt, One Road, and you go, this is just amazing. This is one of the smartest things to build out infrastructure and to connect China to other parts of the world, and it's going to leverage all kinds of real estate development, and it's all sorts of city building, and it's going to be top down. And then you look at the U.S. approach, which is all screwed up, and the Congress is yelling and screaming at one another, the Republicans hate the Democrats, and somebody's going to try to impeach the other guy. But then you look bottom up, and you go, oh my God. Boulder, Ann Arbor, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Newark. Steve and I are going to Newark this afternoon. We can go down the list of 100 places, all doing something remarkable. Maybe the U.S. approach should be the other way. Not try to emulate the top down, activate the bottom up, and begin to dial back. My own sense of the case is the more we could shift authority for innovation policy, economic policy to the local, the better. So we're going to look. The next generation is going to tell us which of these approaches seems to be better. But my cautious optimism is, even in the midst of all this crazy dysfunction at the national level, we just turn that off and turn the dial down, turn the dial up on the local. The U.S. may have some kind of unique advantage there.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I've been spending the last year or so thinking about this and working on a book about grassroots startup community development. And there are an army of initiatives going on an army of people and initiatives and communities all throughout this country the Kauffman Foundation is playing a huge role and convener in this. And it just seems like with a lot of things that cities and civically minded individuals in these cities are going to carry the U.S. forward. It's happening. It has to. We have all this gridlock in Washington, but it's remarkable. It's people in really small places are giving it a good go. I could as I mentioned, the Kauffman Foundation has this summit every year where it's that now they're creating a new job category, startup ecosystem builder, and they're giving these people the tools to do that. So definitely second that. Cool.
Join me in thanking Ian and Richard.